Shalom and welcome to Ikvot HaMashiach, in the footsteps of the Messiah. We're discussing the festival of Sukkot. And for the past few weeks, we've looked at the evidence that Messiah, the King Yeshua, was born during this festival, more than likely the first day of the festival, at the very festival that teaches about the Messianic kingdom. The Messianic King was born. We found that the Hebrew word for a stable is a sukkah. We found that by figuring the dates from the time that John the Baptist was born, or that he was conceived, we could find the time that Yeshua was conceived. Going forward from that, it brought us to the festival of Sukkot. We saw that the angels that came to the shepherds in the field at Bethlehem, that everything that they said was part of the customs and the ceremonies and the things that would be associated with the festival of Sukkot. There was a great light in the skies, the kivod, the glory, the radiance of God shone down upon the shepherds. The festival of Sukkot is called the Feast of Lights. We found that it was a message of great joy, and it's called the season of our joy. We found that it was to all men everywhere, and the festival of Sukkot is to all the nations. The shepherds were told that they would find a babe wrapped in swaddling cloths lying in a manger. This was a sign to them. And we discussed how that at the festival of Sukkot, within the temple, within the courtyard of the women, 4 large posts were set up. On top of each post, 4 vats of oil. And each vat filled huge amount of oil with the used undergarments, or the swaddling cloths of the priest, set down into those as a wick, and lit a giant lamp, casting a great light over all of Jerusalem. This light was called the light of the world. And they're told that this child lying in the manger in this festival of Sukkot, in the midst of the season of Sukkot, is wrapped in the swaddling clothes, is a sign not only to them, but to all the world. We're told that the shepherds run as fast as they come. They come with great haste, and they come and they see the child, and it says then they make it widely known, everything that they have seen, everything that the angels have told them. They know that Yeshua is the Messiah. It is not a matter of opinion. Last week we talked about that night certainly was not a silent night, as is popularly sung, but it was a very noisy and a very loud night. We found that in the city of Bethlehem, here's the town of Bethlehem, and that right next to it is a fortress built by King Herod called Herodian, and it's there that he kept a garrison of troops. These troops assuredly would be the ones later on called to kill the infants within Jerusalem. We started last week, or we finished up rather last week, in the book of Mattathiyahu, or Matthew. And so if you'll turn there to Matthew in chapter 1, this relates to us how that Joseph is betrothed to Miriam, and she conceives the child by the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, and that he's going to give her a bill of divorce. But that the angel of the Lord comes and says, "Fear not to take your wife to yourself. That which is conceived in her is of the power of God. It is of the Spirit of God." And so he's also told that he'll bring forth a son, she'll bring forth a son, and she will call his name Yeshua, which means salvation. In chapter 2, we see, now after Yeshua was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem. Last week we looked at Genesis chapter 29, verse 1, where it told us that the land of the east was the ancient land of Babylon. We discussed how that the Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar, had carried the Jewish people away to captivity. That when Ezra and Zerubbabel came along 70 years later, that only a remnant of the people, only a small portion of the people returned back to the ancient land of Judea. And that in fact, even in the days of Yeshua, that the largest Jewish city in the world was Babylon. And that the majority of the Jews lived in the region of Babylon, the land of the east. We discussed the term the magi. And the magi is understood by most people to be the astrologers. However, that same Greek word magi, when it is translated back into Hebrew, it is hakamim, which means rabbis or sages. So what I'm submitting to you is that these were not men from Japan and China and the Far East, nor am I submitting to you that they were kings, nor am I submitting to you that there were 3 of them. For it simply tells us that men came from the east, that hakamim, that wise men, that rabbis came from the land of Babylon, and they came to King Herod in Jerusalem and said, "Where is he who is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east. And we've come to Jerusalem to worship him." You see, a lot of our songs have formed what we believe about the Bible. And so, again, just like Silent Night wasn't such a silent night, there were not 3 kings from Orient or. Rather, there were 3 Jewish rabbis, or 15 Jewish rabbis, or 20 Jewish rabbis, or whatever. They came having seen the star in the east, and they knew a prophecy, Numbers chapter 24, verse 17, which says, "I see him, but not now. I see him, but not near. A star shall rise out of Jacob, and the scepter out of Israel." The Jewish people, and these were the only people in the world that were looking for this Messiah that would have a star that would go before him. About 100 years after the time of Yeshua, there was a false Messiah that came along, and he was declared by the most prominent rabbi of the time, Rabbi Akiva, to be the Messiah, and they called him Bar Kokhba, which means son of the star, because they knew this prophecy. We see that the star is going to go before them, and we'll be reading that in a few minutes. A lot of people say this was a conglomeration of the planets. It wasn't, because we're told that the star traveled in front of them and stood over the sukkah, or stood over the house where he was born. You see, a star, for this to happen, it is a miracle of God. And it's time that we recognize the miracles of God consistently through the Scripture. There isn't any reason that we need to explain away these things. We're told in verse 3, when Herod the king, chapter 2, book of Matthew, verse 3, when Herod the king heard these things, he was troubled, and all of Jerusalem with him. And I would believe so, because Herod killed right and left. Herod killed his favorite wife, had her strangled. He killed his mother-in-law. He killed his brother-in-law. He killed several of his brother-in-laws, in fact. He killed his sons. One after another, he killed his sons. He had them strangled. He had them drowned. He had them cast off roofs, because Herod was very insecure. Herod was hated by the people, because anybody that came out and threatened his authority, he killed. And he killed, and he killed, and he killed, and he killed, and he killed. And when Herod was troubled, everybody was troubled, because Herod's normal response was to respond in blood. Caesar Augustus once made a statement about Herod. He said it would have been better to have been a pig in the house of Herod than to have been one of his sons. Because you see, Herod, even though he was not an observant Jew, certainly not that, because he offered idols, he offered sacrifices to pagan idols, but he kept a lot of the Jewish law. Herod would not eat pig. He would not eat unkosher food. So a pig in his house was safe, but if you were his son, you were in line to be thrown off the wall or to have your head submerged under a pool somewhere, because the man was that way. So you can imagine how it is. Here come these rabbis from Babylon, and they come saying, "Where is he that's born King of the Jews?" And Herod's thinking, "Who is this that's come to take my throne?" And so all of Jerusalem is troubled. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. So they said to him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Yehudah, are not the least among the rulers of Yehudah, for out of you shall come a ruler, who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod, when he had secretly called the hakamim, the wise men, the sages, the rabbis, determined from them what time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search diligently for the young child. When you've found him, bring back word to me, that I may come and worship him also." When they heard the king, they departed, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them. This is what I mentioned before. It's a miracle of God. Till it came and stood over the young child, where the young child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. There's a saying about the festival of Sukkot, and this reminds me of it. This is found in a book called, this is from the Mishnah. The Mishnah is kind of the how-to books of the Jewish people. And this is a particular section of the Mishnah called Moedim. It deals with the festivals. And we have 3 different books in this volume. One of the books is called Sukkot. Sukkot. And of course, it's going to be on the festival of Sukkot. And I'd like to read to you from Sukkot 5:1. And it says, "They said," meaning an ancient saying of the people, "whoever did not see the rejoicing of the house of the water pouring," which is a festival or a ceremony during the festival of Sukkot, "never saw rejoicing in his lifetime." What we see here is that during this festival of Sukkot, the star is coming forth, and as the star is going forth, the people are following him, the Hakamim are following him, that when they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. Now, a few weeks ago, we drew a picture of a sukkah for you. Here we have a sukkah, if you can imagine, 3 sides, and then it's going to have some slats going across the top of it. Usually you have brush that is put along the way in it. We're going to make this roof to have brush. This is a sukkah, a little temporary shelter. Same word as you have for a stable. You have a requirement in a sukkah, and that requirement is that you leave a hole. Do you see this hole right here? That hole is for the purpose of looking at the stars through the top of the sukkah. What a unique thing. God is doing a miracle of a star indicating the Messiah, and it is literally, the star is standing over this, and I'm just going to use my imagination, but we have the child underneath within this manger, and I believe that the light from the star was probably shining right through down upon the child so that he could be seen in a special light. Verse 11, "And when they had come to the house," and an interesting point is that a sukkah, in Hebrew, a sukkah is called a house. It is a temporary shelter, and you are instructed that you are to live in it, and it is a dwelling for 7 days. "And when they had come into the house, they saw the young child with Miriam his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented gifts to him, gold, frankincense, and myrrh." I'd like to point out to you that later on, when Miriam and Yosef come to the temple, that they offer the offering of 2 young turtle doves, which was the offering of a poor person. If they had all this gold, frankincense, and myrrh, why didn't they use it? Because these are what are called dedicated. In other words, the Hakamim gave these items to them, but the items were to be presented as an offering to the Lord in the temple the next time that Yosef and Miriam would go to the temple. In other words, this doesn't have anything to do with their own personal finances and what they could afford in the for the sacrifices for her purification. So these are dedicated items. Verse 12, "Then being divinely warned in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed from their own country another way." Let's drop and jump over. We see in verse 16, chapter 2, that Herod is going to kill all the children in Jerusalem. Let me see if this is the verse that I need. "Then Herod, when he saw he was deceived by the wise men, was exceedingly angry, and he sent forth and put to death all the male children who were in Bethlehem and in all its districts from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the wise men." We have always taught that he killed all the babies toddler size and below, 2 years and younger. However, there is a custom in the Middle East, very different from what we have here in the United States. When we are born, we are 1 day old. And then 1 year later, we become 1 year old. 2 years after our birth, we become 2 years old. But in the Middle East, the day you are born, you are 1 year old. And then 1 year later, you are 2 years old. Now, that wouldn't be 2 years to us. That would only be 1 year. So actually, Herod, according to their custom, not ours, according to their custom, he killed all of the children 1 year and younger, the way we count time. Notice, something we just kind of glossed over, we missed this as we were reading. We have Bethlehem is right here. Jerusalem is right here. There's 4 miles distance. Herod has a palace right there at Bethlehem. We're going to have these shepherds are going to be going everywhere, and they're carrying the message that the Messiah has come. The Messiah has come. Now we're going to go back to the book of Luke, and we're going to look at a passage here in Luke about when they come to the temple. And I want you to notice this. Verse 22, chapter 2, Luke 2, verse 22. Now when the days of her purification, this is talking about Miriam, Mary, according to the law of Moshe, were completed, they brought him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. As it is written in the Torah of the Lord, every male who opens the child should be called holy to the Lord, and to offer a sacrifice according to what is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. Now this is going to be 40 days after Yeshua is born. They are going to be in the town of Jerusalem, and in fact, they are going to be in the temple within Jerusalem. This is the specific location, and let's see what happens. It says, verse 25, and behold, there was a man in Jerusalem whose name was Simeon, and this man was just and devout, waiting for the consolation of Israel. The consolation of Israel is a term for Messiah. And the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, was upon him. And it had been revealed to him by the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, that he would not see death before he had seen the Lord's Messiah. So he came by the Spirit into the temple, and when the parents brought in the child Yeshua to do for him according to the custom of the Torah, he took him up in his arms and blessed God and said, Lord, now you are letting your servant depart in shalom, in peace, according to your word. For my eyes have seen your Yeshua, your salvation, your Yeshua, which you have prepared before the face of all peoples, a light to bring revelation to the Gentiles, and the glory, the kivod, the radiance of your people Israel. And Joseph and his mother marveled at those things which were spoken of him. Then Shimon blessed them and said to Miriam his mother, behold, this child is destined for the fall and the rising of many in Israel, and for a sign which will be spoken against. Yes, a sword will pierce through your own soul also, that the thoughts of many hearts may be revealed. Let's drop down to verse 36, chapter 2, book of Luke, verse 36. Now there was one Anna, a prophetess, the daughter of Penuel of the tribe of Asher. She was of a great age and had lived with a husband 7 years from her virginity. And this woman was a widow of about 84 years, who did not depart from the temple, but served God with fastings and prayers night and day. And coming in that instant, she gave thanks to the Lord. And look at this next phrase, and spoke of him to all those who looked for redemption in Jerusalem. So Anna, she sees the Messiah. She hears what Simeon is saying. She hears the prophecy that is coming forth. And so we have all over Jerusalem, right here, all over Jerusalem, the message is going out, Messiah is here. Now, how would it spread? Is this hot news? The people were in expectation of the Messiah coming. The people were looking for the Messiah coming. These people, Simeon and Anna, were people that were well known. People that if you came up to the temple as often as you were required, you would have seen these there within the temple, week after week, month after month, year after year. Everyone knew these people, and yet when the Hakamim, the wise men that we read about in Matthew chapter 2, appear to Herod, Herod has not yet heard that Yeshua has been born down at Bethlehem, nor has anyone within the temple, because the scribes and the priests were called from the temple and said, "Where is the Messiah to be born?" No one in Jerusalem has yet heard that Messiah has been born. What I'm submitting to you, if you remember that we have 1 year old, the children were killed. All the children that were 1 year and younger. Herod was the type of man that he would not take any type of chance. He was the type of man that if a child had just been born and he had the message that the child had just been born, then what Herod would do is kill any children 1 year old and younger. That's the type of margin for safety that he had. What I'm submitting to you is that Herod died immediately after Yeshua was born. That in fact, if I can recreate this for you, let's go back over to the book of Matthew in chapter 2. I'm going to paraphrase some of this. We're going to have first, we have Joseph and Miriam come down to Jerusalem and then on to Bethlehem. It's the festival of Sukkot. And at the festival of Sukkot, he registers for the taxation. As they're there, it's the first day of Sukkot, and Miriam begins to conceive the child, or she begins to have the baby. They go into the sukkah. They go into the sukkah, and they are in a sukkah. When the baby is born, she wraps him in swaddling cloths and lays him in the manger. Across the road, in the shepherd's field, there are shepherds that are watching sheep. The angels, a heavenly host comes and tells them that the Messiah has been born. They come to see the Messiah, and they are overcome with joy. They are so excited, and they're running to the hills telling that Messiah has been born. Now, almost immediately, you can be assured that Herod's men there at Herodian would have heard the message of the shepherds. That type of news would have been carried immediately to Herod with his spy network. In fact, over at the temple in Jerusalem, it must have been heard. So, I believe that just as the shepherds were coming to see the Messiah there in the manger, the Hakamim, the wise men, were coming into Jerusalem, because the news had not yet traveled to the city 4 miles away. They come and they ask Herod. Herod sends for the scribes and the Sepharim, the priests and so on, to come, and they say that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. They follow the star down to Bethlehem, and there in Bethlehem, the star stands over the sukkah. Inside the sukkah, they can look up through the hole in the roof, they can see the star, and the wise men come. They lay down to sleep, and that night they're warned in a dream to flee, to go back by another way, and Joseph is told to flee to the land of Egypt, fulfilling a prophecy from the book of Hosea, chapter 11, verse 1, where it was said, "Out of Egypt have I called my firstborn." During the journey, in other words, they left that first night. During the journey on the 8th day, which would be the 8th day of the year, in other words, the day called the 8th day, Shmini Atzeret, the day that is attached to Sukkot, they circumcised Yeshua. In other words, on the road to Egypt. As they're there, shortly after they arrive, they stay for a period of time, and then they are told in a dream that they can return to the land because Herod has died. During this time, they come back, they come into the temple. It has now been 40 days. They come into the temple, and Simeon will prophesy over the child. Anna will come in, and then she lets everyone there within the city know that King Messiah has come. I'd like for you to go to a prophecy in the book of Isaiah about the birth of the Messiah in chapter 9. Now, this prophecy is very interesting to us because it will tell us about the baby that is coming, about the child that is born, but before it, everything that is said is in the phraseology, the terminology of the festival of Sukkot. Isaiah chapter 9, Verse 1, nevertheless, the gloom will be upon her who is distressed, as when at first he lightly esteemed the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, and afterward more heavily oppressed her by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan and Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Remember that the festival of Sukkot is called the Feast of Lights. The one that came forth at the festival of Sukkot, Yeshua the Messiah, he is the light of the world. Those who dwelt in the land of the shadow of death, upon them a light has shined. You have multiplied the nation and increased its joy. What is Sukkot called? The season of our joy. They rejoice before you according to the joy of the harvest, as men rejoice when they divide the spoil. Do you remember that at the festival of Sukkot, it is the feast of the ingathering of the harvest? For you have broken the yoke of his burden and the staff of his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, as in the day of Midian. For every warrior's sandal from the noisy battle and garments rolled in blood will be used for burning and fuel for fire. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end, upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to order it and establish it with judgment and justice. From that time forward, even forever, the zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. Next week, in the footsteps of the Messiah.